Happy First Amendment Day. It's finally here. It's like Christmas. But better than Christmas, I'm sure. Thank you for coming. Our keynote speaker tonight is Gred Lukianoff, sitting right there on my left. Mr. Lukianoff is the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, an organization known as FIRE. Mr. Lukianoff has been with FIRE since 2001, when he was hired to be the organization's first director of legal and public advocacy. He's a graduate of American University and of Stanford Law School, where he studied First Amendment and constitutional law. Before joining FIRE, Mr. Lukianoff practiced law in Northern California and interned at the ACLU of Northern California and with the Organization for Aid to Refugees in Prague in the Czech Republic. Mr. Lukianoff has published articles and publications ranging from the Stanford Technology Law Review to the New York Post. He blogs for the Huffington Post and is a frequent guest on local and national radio and television shows. He has testified before the U.S. Senate about free speech issues on America's campuses, and in 2008, he was the first ever recipient of the Playboy Foundation Freedom of Expression Award. Singular honor, I think. FIRE is a nonprofit educational foundation based in Philadelphia. Its mission is to defend individual rights in America's colleges and universities. These rights include freedom of speech, of course, but also legal equality, due process, religious liberty, and sanctity of conscience. In addition to legal work on behalf of individual students and faculty, FIRE works nationally to inform the public about the condition of liberty on college campuses. Some of you probably are familiar with FIRE, and others of you have at least heard of it. While Mr. Lukianoff has never been in Chapel Hill, he certainly has made his self known here. In 2004, FIRE represented Alpha Iota Omega, an evangelical Christian fraternity here at Carolina, in a legal fight against the university. The fraternity was denied official university recognition in 2003 after the fraternity objected to signing a student organization non-discrimination agreement that would have forbidden it from considering religion when determining who could become a member of the fraternity. FIRE argued that the fraternity's constitutionally protected freedom of association gave the fraternity the right to exclude from membership people who did not share the beliefs of the group. The fraternity sued the university, and there's some legal wrangling that ensued after that. Eventually, the university changed its policy to allow student organizations to select their members on the basis of their commitment to political or religious beliefs, and at that point, a judge declared that the lawsuit was moot and dismissed it. So when I called South Building to tell them we were having First Amendment Day, and the good news was somebody was coming from FIRE, they were shrieking, momentary shrieks in South Building. While the problems of this fraternity are not the subject of debate on campus today, there is a debate about the limits, if any, of free expression on this campus. I can't think of a recent time it's been more heated, and I'm confident that Mr. Lukianoff will help to inform that debate. Mr. Lukianoff, welcome to Carolina.
Thank you very much. I'm trying out this microphone that I have on my lapel. Can you all hear me? Is this actually working? Wow, that's really neat. All right, cool. Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction. It's funny, it took a couple of years for my alma mater, Stanford, to invite me back to speak there after I got in a fight with them once a couple of years ago. But it's my job, and it's what I went to law school to do. So tomorrow will have been with FIRE for 8 years. It was a very small organization. I left San Francisco in order to join a little office of only 4 people in Philadelphia, and I'm kind of amazed that we're actually celebrating our 10-year anniversary next year. But given what's going on campus, I give there are a lot of different speeches I give, but I wanted to kind of take this back to first principles in some ways, and I wanted to talk about the other Reverend Lovejoy that a lot of people don't study. I'm not talking about the one on The Simpsons, whose name is actually Timothy Lovejoy. He was notoriously anti-Catholic, but rather Reverend Elijah Parrish Lovejoy. He was born on November 9th, 1802, and he died November 7th, 1837. Prior to the death of Reverend Lovejoy, there was understanding in the U.S. that the First Amendment only protected people from encroachment of rights by Congress, by the government itself. If you got in a fight or someone tried to shut you up, that was considered not so much to be the law's business. Reverend Lovejoy was an outspoken abolitionist, and he was chased out of Missouri and was hunted down in Acton, Illinois, and he died defending his abolitionist printing press. Well, by at that point, an angry mob of pro-slavery people shot him. And it was a real turning point in Americans' understanding of what liberty meant. It suddenly became quite clear, and to understand, in 1837, America was nowhere near having a popular consensus that slavery was wrong. But they did at least understand that if you can be killed for having an opinion, having a passionate opinion on a major topic of the day, that liberty doesn't mean a great deal at all. And since then, we have very much understood as a country, with fading recollections from time to time, that there is a twofold obligation on the First Amendment. First is to not censor, not to pass laws that abridge the free speech. The second is not to allow mobs to silence opinions that people don't like, because really, if you allow that, then freedom of speech doesn't really matter much. One of the brilliant things about our system of government is that we're all bound together in our rights, that our rights are all tied together and that we all sink or swim together. And one of the things that's great about studying First Amendment law, and one of the reasons why I love studying it so much, are these constant, disparate-seeming stories of communists and radical civil rights activists and anti-Vietnam War activists and white supremacists. And when you read Supreme Court opinions from the 1930s to the 1960s, it really is striking and really kind of amazing that the rights of a white supremacist group in one decision could be decided by the rights of the NAACP in a previous. And I think there's probably no better mechanism for keeping rights protected for everyone than to say that, well, ultimately, your free speech is tied to this other person's free speech. If you want to take it away from him, you're taking it away from yourself, ultimately. And I think this is a brilliant mechanism for protecting free speech in a pluralistic, multicultural society. But that's an instrumentalist reason for believing in free speech. I think that there are deep philosophical reasons for believing in it, beyond just self-interest, beyond just I can get in trouble too if this exception is allowed. And I feel like nobody's really said it better than John Stuart Mill did in his 1859 book on liberty. 1859 is actually a real watershed year. It was actually also the date of the publication of Origin of Species. So to have On Liberty and Origin of Species published in the same year definitely was a year that changed human history. On Liberty, Mill the arguments are just very hard to overcome. And the interesting thing that I run into about apathy about freedom of speech, and probably the most primitive argument that I run into, is that it's an old idea, so it can't possibly be that sophisticated. There are deep, meaningful reasons to believe into it, and deep moral reasons and philosophical reasons for believing in it. And the argument that Mill made was, first of all, the proposition that we're not infallible or omniscient. Now you say this and people go, well, of course we're not. I feel like we're living in a country right now where two different sides of the argument are acting both like they are infallible and omniscient, and the other side has absolutely nothing worth saying. I think that's a shame. What that means is that we can be wrong, and that debate actually can point out sometimes that you might actually be wrong. Now that's one of the most obvious reasons why we need freedom of speech. And it's hard to see that you're wrong until in some cases you debate somebody. But the other reasons that Mill gave, that's the most obvious one. The other reasons that Mill gave, I think, are equally as important, if not immediately apparent. One of them is even if we're right, we might not be totally right. There might be some aspect in the debate that we're not quite getting, some portion of the truth that we're not quite understanding or nodding to. And in the political process, when it works correctly, it is this constant retweaking of our positions and our beliefs to understand the circumstances as they actually exist. We might be partially wrong. The third one is that even if you just happen to be that lucky person who on a particular issue is entirely and objectively correct, that if we're not permitted to vigorously and earnestly contest our opinions, we start believing things as prejudices without really understanding why we believe them in the first place. And I think you probably run into this a lot on campus. People know that they either oppose or support affirmative action, but they're not very good at explaining why. And the basic idea of this debate of ideas is that if we don't have to defend our beliefs and values, they lose their vitality. They become merely rote formulas, not deep, living, creative convictions capable of leading us to sincere and great things. In other words, we don't without freedom of speech, without debate, we don't understand the logic of how we got to our conclusions in the first place. And again, we end up holding them more like prejudices. This prevents us from getting to correct conclusions in the future. So ultimately, one of the things for the different philosophies that I study is that free speech is not merely a legalism. It is a philosophy of an enlightened approach to being human. I'm not omniscient. Hear people out. Painful ideas can have truth in them. It's a philosophy of life, not merely a legalism. And I fear that our society is forgetting these lessons. We're starting to regard people who disagree with us as morally sick, not worthy of even addressing. And that's a dangerous thing, because one thing that actually is interesting about the First Amendment is nobody would look at FIRE and say, well, that's a humble organization. But ultimately, at the heart of the First Amendment is a humility, is this idea that we don't know, that we're not, and that through debate and discussion, we recognize the humility that we can always be corrected. So let's take a look at the situation at UNC. First of all, I want to compliment, how many people were here at the previous discussion? Okay, I got to do a little bit of a recap. So it was between Haley Koch, and Nikhil from Youth for Western Civilization. There was the big to-do last year where the students from one group allegedly disrupted an event by the Youth for Western Civilization when they invited Tom Tancredo to speak on campus. Now, I have to say, the thing that I was most impressed with was he actually got Haley and Nikhil to sit down at the same table and actually talk about their positions on different things. And I really want to hand it to them for doing that. That's something that, given how heated the debate was, I didn't think would even be possible. Now, Haley, however, argued two things that I just think are important to understand what's wrong with them. Haley argued that Tancredo chose to leave and it wasn't their fault. And two, that it was not a violation of the First Amendment for her group to disrupt the speech because she is not Congress. And the First Amendment says, in its plain language, that Congress shall make no law. Okay, so first of all, point one. I agree with Haley. She was holding a banner. She's allowed to hold a banner. She's allowed to protest. So as far as her involvement was concerned, that's protected speech, absolutely. However, throwing a brick through a window or breaking a window, however the window got broke in the course of that video, it was clear that someone broke a window, is not only illegal, it's pretty much textbook examples of intimidation and violence to shut down speech. This is why I opened up with the example of Reverend Lovejoy. That's not how you deal with opinions with which you disagree. You don't try to scare them off campus, you try to debate them. And the state, Haley's argument that she is not Congress, well, literally true, is barely and technically right because the First Amendment actually confers on UNC a duty to punish her or prevent punish the rock thrower or window breaker, the people actually disrupting the speech. So it's not that directly she is actually technically violating the First Amendment, but the First Amendment requires her to be stopped or punished. So it was an extremely technical point. She also made the argument that there is no, that hate speech should not be protected. Now, one thing I have to say with my lawyer hat on, there is no First Amendment exception for hate speech. And I'm going to go one step further, nor should there be. Because it always ends up being, well, whose speech is hateful? Certainly in American history, there are times when people have, I mean, actually going back to the abolitionist days, one of the arguments that was proffered by Southern slave owners was that you should, that angry speech, abolitionist speech in the North should be stopped because it was hurting the feelings and was hateful against slave owners in the South. So this is an argument that's been around for a long time, but it does show how difficult it is to even figure out whose hate are we talking about in the first place. Now, the funny thing is, people always try to sort of get, First Amendment advocates and academic freedom advocates on crazy examples of speech that, well, certainly, Mr. First Amendment guy, this shouldn't be protected, particularly on a college campus. And the example that's usually given is Holocaust denial. I'm going to say something that might surprise you. I think having Holocaust denial speakers on campus is a good thing. You know why? Because the best argument they have for denying the Holocaust is that there was Jewish-specific yellow fever between 1943 and 1945 that account for the coincidentally 6 million dead Jewish people during that time. That's a terrible argument. You want everyone to hear that argument. Because the only way Holocaust denial is actually able to succeed is that if people have to whisper it into each other's ears without having to actually contest it and fight it out in public. When they say, oh, and usually since they're anti-Semites, they'll probably say, well, since there's a Jewish conspiracy to keep me from telling you the truth about the Holocaust, I can't really explain it, but it didn't really happen. When you actually have to get them get up and explain, well, it's just Jewish-specific yellow fever. Yeah, come on, please. Let that argument be out there. And also, there's an additional benefit to letting that argument be out there, by the way, is you know who the racists in the room are, and you know who you shouldn't be turning your backs to. There are lots of benefits for these things actually being out in the open. There's a professor actually, I believe it, at Penn, who talked about how the corrosive effect of so-called hate speech codes, it leads us to a society where people think that actually secretly behind their back and behind closed doors, people are saying really hateful things about each other, and the only things that are preventing them from doing that are the laws. I think it's better to know who the hateful people are in the room. I think it's helpful to know, and I think in some cases people would be surprised who isn't in some cases. Generally, I don't believe that ignorance sells that well in the marketplace of ideas. And that is the thing. That's the thing that people have the hardest time dealing with. Is that, so you're saying that there's, administrators approach me a lot about this. So you're saying there's nothing we can do if someone says something genuinely racist on campus. Of course that's not what we're saying. I mean, I graduated Stanford back in 2000, but certainly if someone said something generally racist on campus, that person would suffer all the appropriate social sanctions that you should suffer for that. They would be criticized. They would be ostracized. They certainly weren't going to be hanging out with anybody. And that's the way we actually deal with these things in a free society. The reason why you don't want to put this power in the hands of administrators or people who have power is because it leads very quickly to abuses. You tell people that you have to police speech that other people might experience as offensive, and suddenly you realize that almost any speech can be experienced as offensive. And you will also notice, as Mill pointed out, that the speech that the person with the power doesn't like, not coincidentally, ends up being the speech that consistently gets shut up. And speech that might be equally offensive or hateful that the person in power disagrees with gets a pass all the time. And that's just the way, and the idea is to keep this power out of the hands of people in power because it will lead immediately to abuses and prevent open discussion. Now, to the title of my speech. The thing I've been talking about for years is this phenomenon that I call unlearning liberty. And I actually feel like this is something that's been going on at many levels of our society, where students actually, I feel like, are experiencing a pretty comprehensive environment where they're not getting good examples of what free speech is. They're not being taught the basic principles of free speech. And in some senses, students misunderstanding it so much that they think that shattering a window during a speech is actually acceptable because nobody's taught them otherwise. And what I fear is that students are actually learning that they have a duty to silence speech that they consider unprogressive or uncomfortable, for that matter. And what's worst of all is that I see in a lot of students that they actually see this as a noble and romantic end to silence people who have opinions they disagree with. I think that's a long-term threat to the health of our democracy, to be completely honest. Now, probably the most obvious manifestation of this unlearning liberty phenomena is newspaper theft. And every year, FIRE and my second favorite nonprofit, the Student Press Law Center, receive reports from all over the country of students destroying, stealing student newspapers that have articles that they disagree with. In at least 4 or 5 examples in the last 10 years, students have actually burned those student newspapers. My dad grew up in a Nazi-occupied Yugoslavia, so I can't tell you how much it terrifies me to see students burning newspapers they disagree with. And I think it should scare anybody who cares about the health of a democracy. And where are they learning this? And I would argue that in a lot of cases they're learning it from colleges. Not obviously people who host First Amendment Day, but from a lot of bad examples. I think the bad examples, are the most powerful ones. Now, I'm going to give you some examples about FIRE cases. At Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, a student employee was found guilty of racial harassment, this was just 2 years ago, for publicly reading a book. The book was called Notre Dame versus the Klan. It celebrated the defeat of the Klan in a 1924 riot where the Klan tried to attack Notre Dame, which is a Catholic school, and a bunch of Irish students fought them off. But because it had pictures of a Klan rally related to this event on the cover, and people experienced those pictures as being disturbing, he was found guilty of racial harassment without a hearing, by the way, or a chance to explain that this book wasn't even racist. Now, to be clear, if he was reading Mein Kampf, he would have been allowed to do so also. And I don't know what's happened to our society that we actually would assume that, oh, you're reading Mein Kampf, that must mean you love Hitler. No, it might mean you're just a German studies major. At Valdosta State University, an environmentalist student, Hayden Barnes, was kicked off of campus, and he was immediately expelled, and he was required to go see a psychologist because he was a quote-unquote clear and present danger on campus because of a collage he put on Facebook. Hayden Barnes opposed, this is also within the last 2 years, by the way, all of these examples are. Hayden Barnes opposed a parking garage on campus on environmental grounds. The president called him into his office and gave him a dressing down, somewhat pathetically referring to the parking garage as being part of his quote-unquote legacy for Valdosta State University. Picking on this strange claim, Hayden Barnes' collage referred to the parking garage as the President Zachariah Memorial Parking Garage, picking on his legacy. The president then tried to claim this was a clear threat on the president's life. They stapled a picture of the collage to his expulsion letter and slipped it under his door. Now, this kind of undermines the idea that they actually thought this guy was going to be the next show. If you think someone's just about to go on a murderous rampage, you don't slip a note under his door. They also picked the wrong student. Hayden Barnes, actually, he studies the same kind of Buddhism I study, the Shambhala Buddhism, so that was a really neat thing to discover, which believes in non-aggression. And he is a decorated EMT. You couldn't really find someone who's more unimpeachable than Hayden Barnes. So we fought that case, too. Meanwhile, if we look at our red alert list, we have a case at Brandeis, which is right out of a Philip Roth novel, where a professor was found guilty in his Latin American Studies class, again of racial harassment, without a hearing, for using the word wetback in his Latin American Studies class to explain where the epithet comes from and to decry its use. He was using the word to condemn it, and he was found guilty of racial harassment at Brandeis. And Brandeis, incidentally, a school that named for and promises the rights as envisioned by Justice Louis Brandeis, probably the greatest champion, at least in my opinion, of free speech in the United States, possibly in our history. Meanwhile, at Tufts University, when conservative students were unhappy with what they thought was an overly rosy depiction of Islam during Islamic Awareness Week, published an ad that included quotes from the Quran and other verifiable facts as basically a counterpoint. I looked into whether or not these were true facts, and one of the things that they said was that the only countries that punish homosexuality by death are seven Islamic theocracies. That's the one fact they got wrong. There are actually 8 Islamic theocracies that punish homosexuality by death. But otherwise, everything in this was completely verifiable. And so, to my knowledge, it's the first time actually in American history that a completely verifiable statement was found guilty of racial harassment, the factual statement. And the university has not backed down from this finding. Meanwhile, at Michigan State University, a student, and this was only 6 months ago, was found guilty of spamming for writing, about 5% of her professors, a very respectful letter that she's actually a member of the student government, saying that you cut down the semester by 2 years, but you're not, by 2 days, and you're not giving us that money back. This is inappropriate. You didn't consult students on this, and she was brought up on charges of spamming. So meanwhile, other things that I think could contribute to this environment, are in some cases outright aggressive behavior by administrators, and I've run into a lot of this from resident life officials. The University of Delaware being one of the most horrifying examples that I've seen of it. I definitely was not ready for this case. Where they had floor exercises that required people to reveal what their political opinions were on different issues, and then go stand by one wall if they were the right opinion and stand by another wall if they were the wrong ones. And I'm like, are you serious that you're actually having a public shaming of people on the basis of political belief on a public campus? Laughably unconstitutional, by the way. But the one that actually stunned me the most was a mandatory questionnaire that students were required to, and think about how creepy this is. A questionnaire on what races and sexes you would date, with the idea of getting you more open to date different races and different sexes. Now, keep in mind, these are state officials. Imagine Joe Biden giving you this questionnaire. And it's a one-on-one session with your RA. Freshman girl, student, male RA, questionnaire about your sexual identity. She fills out the sexual identity question saying that, the question is, when did you discover your sexual identity? She responded, none of your damn business. And she was written up for an incident report that could have included a filing of harassment. And they actually proudly said that, like, well, we didn't actually pursue charges against her. And I'm like, good for you? So anyway, and so that there definitely is an ideological component that can get really nuts. And again, before working at Fire, I had no idea how bad it was. But then there's just the case where people just have no idea what they're talking about. And this really came out during the election. It's slightly technical, but university after university across the country told their students that they couldn't do things like send articles, like my Huffington Post piece, to their friends, because that would endanger the university's nonprofit status because it constituted them endorsing a candidate. Now, what their nonprofit status means is that UNC, for example, cannot endorse a candidate, as in the president cannot say UNC formally endorses Barack Obama or John McCain. It sure as hell doesn't mean that the college Democrats or the college Republicans cannot endorse their candidate, or that you can send political articles to your friends. It just defies description. At University of Texas Austin, students were actually made to take down the Barack Obama posters under this rationale and threatened with expulsion because they thought it was going to result in the university losing its 501c3 status. I have no idea how you could get through law school and actually believe that this is the case. It just doesn't make any sense. University of Illinois, students were told and professors were told that they can't have bumper stickers advocating the candidate of their choice. And again, this just comes from just them not knowing a thing about the First Amendment. These are university general counsels we're talking about here. And then there are the speech codes. Probably the funniest thing that I run into is that people seem to think that speech codes were something that happened in the 1990s and then went away. And they can be forgiven for thinking that because there were no less than 5 decisions that universally overturned speech codes from 1989 to 1995. And actually one of them was at Stanford before I got there. And we have constitutionally specialized lawyers actually doing all this research, but our research indicates that of 364 institutions, 270 of them, 74%, have policies that would violate the First Amendment. Weirdly, The incidence of unconstitutional codes is higher at public universities, which are directly bound by the First Amendment, 77%, than they are at private, which aren't. Now I'm going to give you some examples of what we mean by speech codes, and actually, thankfully, a lot of these are codes that we actually eventually defeated. Hampshire College and Massachusetts banned psychological intimidation and harassment of any person or pet. Texas Tech University maintained a policy for all 28,000 students that if they wanted to engage in free speech activities, now keep in mind this is one of the physically largest schools in the country, that they had to go to the lone free speech gazebo. These activities included handing out student newspapers, handing out flyers and pamphlets. I had a friend who has a math degree from MIT do the dimensional analysis of this, and he worked out that if, God forbid, all 28,000 students should want to exercise their free speech at once, you would have to crush them down to the density of uranium-238. Meanwhile, Northeastern University, where Nat Hentoff comes from, they have a computer use policy which prohibits students from using email accounts or servers to send any message that, quote unquote, in the sole judgment of the university, is annoying or offensive. So we are all guilty. But the most common type, and I think this is one of the reasons why speech codes have been successful, and this has been the case since the beginning, is that harassment codes are most usually the codes that are overbroad. And keep in mind that this has been the same from the beginning. The first speech code that was overturned in 1989 at Michigan was a code that couched its what it was banning as harassment. And of course, you're going to have a hard time making it sound like, oh, we should have a speech code that bans speech. It's like, no, if you recharacterize it as harassment, then we got to win. And I experienced this myself. When I was in law school, I don't believe people should be racially or sexually harassed. But but partially because people get so uncritical under these circumstances, then you can put really broad language in these policies. And as you've seen, these policies get abused on a shockingly regular basis. So certainly, defined correctly, there are groups that don't agree with this, but certainly FIRE believes that nobody should be racially or sexually harassed, but it certainly doesn't mean reading a book or publishing an op-ed, as we've seen before. So I'll give you some examples of harassment policies that we're talking about, just to be clear. Western Michigan University harassment policy actually, until FIRE became involved, banned sexism. That is the perception, they're banning a perception, and treatment of any person not as an individual, but as a member of a category based on sex. So my perceiving someone as a man or a woman is actually technically sexual harassment at Western Michigan. And so much for men's rooms and boys' rooms, men's room and girls' room. University of Iowa, I actually like this one because it actually have the force of a rule that you could be brought up in charges of, and it reads like it's written by a fourth grader. This is the way they define sexual harassment. Occurs when somebody says or does something sexually related that you don't want them to do regardless of who it is. That's a rule. Davidson College, they still maintain this policy, and we've been picking on Davidson for this forever, defines sexual harassment as necessarily including, quote-unquote, patronizing remarks. And they go on to list what includes patronizing remarks, and this includes the term honey, doll, baby, sweetie, or hunk. Now, I find this funny for a whole bunch of different reasons, not the least of which a lot of my friends are performers, and it's constantly, hey, baby, how you doing? We're very sweet with each other. But hunk and doll? I mean, it's like either the 1980s or the 1950s to whoever's writing these things. And the saddest part of this is that the final statement is that and again, defining as sexual harassment, comments or inquiries about dating. I don't know how you date without either commenting or inquiring about it. And the funny thing is, all of this is wildly unconstitutional, at least at public colleges like University of North Carolina. And you don't have to, you can go back much farther than the 1989 decision Doe v. Michigan. You go with the Papish case, 1973, in which a student had published an article about a cop getting off for what she thought was police brutality, and also a student from a group called, there's going to be some strong language in this presentation, Up Against the Wall, Motherfucker. That's the name of the group, and the headline read, Motherfucker Acquitted. And See, con law can be fun. And she was kicked out of school for this. Miss Papish was. And the Supreme Court wrote that the mere dissemination of ideas, no matter how offensive to good taste, on a state university campus may not be shut off in the name of conventions of decency alone. This is a 1973 opinion, open and shut, in my opinion. But there have been, at this point, I think we've reached the point where there have been 12 challenges, or maybe 13 challenges to codes that FIRE has marked as red light codes. Every single one of them has been overturned. So when people question, it's like, oh, 77% sounds like a lot. Well, we have a 100% success rate so far, so I think that's, we might reconsider if we actually get beaten one of these times. So where is this coming from? And I think this is an important question. I think that, political correctness is not dead. I think that, and it's amazing how often I hear this. It's like, oh, this is a problem they had in the 90s. And no, sorry, it's still alive. But that's just one part of the ideological component. I think, and one of the reasons why I don't particularly like the term political correctness is because conservatives and liberals mean entirely different things when they talk about it. Liberals tend to mean flight attendant. Conservatives tend to mean brainwashing. But there is an ideology where essentially that you students can't handle words. That you can't handle people saying things that you don't like, that hurt your feelings. It's an extremely patronizing idea, frankly, and students have been fighting against this forever, and it makes me sad when I see a lot of articles written by students advocating speech codes. Without them entirely understanding, it's like you're saying that you should have fewer rights than you actually do, and possibly not the right to write this article in the first place. Okay. Now, there are other reasons why this problem has become bigger, and one of them, frankly, is bureaucracy. I do think that the rise in the administrative class at universities has created these positions that is, frankly, looking for things to do, and that's how you end up with programs like they had at University of Delaware. There's also the obsession with risk management and liability. I won't bore you too much with that, but it's a big part of it, too, that universities actually, at this point, believe that it's safer to ban speech than to deal with frivolous lawsuits. But the fourth factor that I've just run into, and it just really kind of, frankly, breaks my heart, is that students and a lot of administrators alike are simply not educated about the concepts of liberty. Nobody has bothered to tell some of these administrators or students that these are beautiful concepts. And I use the word beautiful on purpose, because particularly when you're fighting people who believe that the best thing they can do is shut down that speaker because of the hateful things they say, that protecting their right to actually say that thing so that you can have the opportunity to refute it in reasoned argument, to me, is a beautiful, beautiful concept. It allows a nation made up of people of wildly different ideologies to live together. They don't not taught that there are sophisticated concepts with the backing of some of the greatest legal and philosophical minds of all time. Now, I'm glad to actually be in a room that has a number of classrooms about media law, and from talking to the media professors, definitely journalism students get these issues a lot better than a lot of people, partially because if you've ever actually been a journalist, you realize that, first of all, every exception that people want to create to freedom of speech they think is incredibly well-intentioned. And no matter how well-intentioned it may be, the first people who are going to suffer are journalists. Another thing they're not taught is that free speech is necessary, not hostile, to a genuinely diverse, pluralistic, and yes, multicultural society. Indeed, in the normal society, free speech is actually designed to protect minority rights. You don't need a separate amendment in a democracy to protect popular mainstream opinions, because democracy itself protects those rights. You need a First Amendment to protect the opinions of the few, so that it's not the case that the majority gets to oppress the minority every 4 years. And it is true that free speech is a hard road, and it's not entirely intuitive. And if you're not taught it, you're not shown it or live enmeshed in it, how can you be expected to learn it? The example that I like to give of something that I feel like is counterintuitive about freedom of speech's value is when I was in law school, there was a conservative student who used to like to sort of agitate everybody. And one of the things he sent out was something advocating Second Amendment rights and picking on our liberal student populace for not being able to handle discussion of guns. A couple students wrote in and talked about friends that they had who'd been shot and killed. I wrote in about a friend that I had who'd been shot and killed. I'd never told anybody about this before. My friend, Bobby, who grew up actually in South Central, gave a lot of stories that he would never talk about under normal circumstances. People brought up case law that I'd never heard of. People brought up philosophers I'd never heard of. They brought up philosophers I had heard of but had never read that particular quote. They gave personal stories, personal testimonials. And at the end of this discussion that we never would have had otherwise, getting to know each other better as people, getting to understand philosophies better, getting to understand law better, someone actually wrote in and said, and this is why he never should have said it in the first place. And I just shook my head and said, did you see what just happened? Because something that someone said that you could argue, and it would be wrong, but you could argue that the speech itself might have had no value, but the discussion it led to was priceless. So, in conclusion, free speech remains a radical idea. It's always been a radical idea. It's an eternally radical idea, and it's challenged in every generation. Only the rationales change. The saddest part is the censored of one generation too often become the censors of the next. Our ultimate goal is to break this sad and predictable cycle and prove that students at America's colleges and universities are strong enough and smart enough to live with truly free and open debate. Thank you for having me, and I'll take questions. Yes, sir. Is there an amplification device of some kind? No. Ah, fine. I'll just repeat the question. Yes, sir. Yes, you.
Oh, thanks. With regard to the banner, in this case, the banner was something like 3 feet tall, 15 feet wide, and it was initially held at the side of the auditorium.
Okay.
There was no objection. Then it was brought to the front, completely blocking
Right.
the speaker's view.
Right.
Is that still acceptable?
If your behavior actually prevents someone from speaking or prevents someone from seeing someone who's speaking, you can certainly be stopped. It's something that the university could easily regulate and should, because it actually is preventing people from hearing or seeing the speaker. Absolutely.
That was the case.
Okay, got it. Okay, I didn't understand that. Okay, good. Thank you. Appreciate it. Point of clarification. Oh, if anybody wants to go out to dinner afterwards, by the way, I'm starving.
Me too.
There must be more questions. Surely there must be more questions.
Yeah, I'll ask her.
Oh, no. Oh, come on. Oh, ma'am, in back. I'm having a hard time hearing you. Sorry. Oh, she's...
I'm wondering if you would comment about Pelosi's statement
Oh, what's the latest?
about her concern about the debate and
Yeah.
referencing the murder, about the potential for passionate
Right.
language to excite violence.
Sure. Yeah, definitely, and I'll take it a little bit broader. The tenor of debate in the country right now is scaring me quite a bit. I feel like that we're having these big, important debates over big, important issues, and we sound like a bunch of third graders on a lot of these issues that have to be carefully thought out. Now, when it comes to incitement, the way the law states it is that basically you have to, if you're encouraging someone to kill somebody, it has to be kind of like, we're going to go, or to commit an act, we're going to go burn down the mayor's office. Everybody who's with me, that's incitement. Also, frankly, it's conspiracy to burn down the mayor's office. So that's the standard. I do think Pelosi was entirely within their rights, though, to say that basically, like, when people start getting uncritical and things get overheated, it can lead to bad downstream consequences. And this is where people get a little bit confused. Having that opinion is not the same thing as saying that someone who says something against the president should be immediately arrested. Those are two very distinct things. But the interesting thing about when people really want to go after a lot of these fringe groups, whether they be on the left or the right, that actually might try something like blow up the Brooklyn Bridge or kill the president or something like that, they're usually doing a lot more illegal things than just saying bad stuff. And if all they're doing is saying bad stuff, then they actually do have the right to do that. Now, one thing I do have to remind everybody of it: fiercely criticizing the president is a time-honored tradition in the U.S. And you look at some of the stuff that Jackson said about Adams and Adams said about Jackson, vice versa, or I guess that would be this third presidential election. It makes your toes curl, some of the stuff they were throwing at each other. So certainly saying mean things about the president is something that's it comes with the territory. And I think Obama, when he's addressed this, has actually been has understood this pretty well. But can Pelosi say? Can she say that there is concern that basically, if people get too sort of like irrational and riled up, it could lead to bad downstream circumstances? She's entirely within her rights. I can't hear her. Sorry.
No, I'm not. The question isn't whether or not she has the right to say it.
Uh-huh.
How the way she's framing the situation, framing the argument that she is framing.
Okay, I guess since I didn't hear her calling for laws or anything like that, I mean, I have to admit, I'm a First Amendment advocate, so I tend to see things in the view of what you have the right to do and what you don't have the right to do. And I didn't hear her calling for people being arrested for inciting the environment against the president, just warning that this could potentially be a bad thing. So, I think she totally has the right to do that. So I'm sorry that that's the way my brain works. That sounds like there's more questions.
Where he's right. He can hear me because I'm right here.
Yeah, I can just repeat it.
So I'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about the source of the chill wind. So you mentioned a few on-campus sources.
Yep.
And she brings up suggests another two, and that is in our political class. And there seems to be some techniques I'm wondering if you noticed too. One is, for example, there seems to be like an apology alert every day.
Yeah.
A politician says something,
and they apologize. Yeah.
Punishment.
Yep.
Right. There's sort of punishment in the political arena.
Yep.
Are we learning it from that too? Is that another?
Oh yeah. That's something. Now this gets me into much more sort of speculative territory, but I definitely that sort of the tenor of the debate has me writing Huffington Post columns like crazy in my head that I'll never have a time to actually sit down and write. I'm going to get a little bit beyond kind of what FIRE does, and I think that at some point, and it seemed to me, at least I noticed it more in the 1990s, that we kind of forgot that we've always been a multi-party country. We just happen to have two parties for a lot of different political, and in some cases I think actually sensible reasons. And it's almost as if we've transformed into two sort of armed camps where we just don't listen to each other at all on particular issues. And this sort of armed camp mentality has led to tactics where basically the goal is to shut down what the other person's saying, because you already know that they're wrong because they're in the other camp. And this is, in my opinion, very, very dangerous, and I'm not really sure how to really diffuse that. And I fear that we have to get back to teaching. And one of the places that potentially could defuse this is actually higher education, is actually our colleges and universities. And I think it's very good that First Amendment days are being held, and I think we need more of them. Because I fear that actually in colleges, in some cases, they're actually making some perceptions of free. Some perceptions that free speech is actually a bad thing, that's actually in the way of progress, that actually through things like speech codes and through things like ridiculous actions like I fight on a daily basis, that it's actually making things worse, not better. So the role of education should actually be preparing people to hear people who have opinions that they despise, to get used to fighting it out with the Tom Tancredos, if that the case may be, the people that they passionately disagree with, because that will make them, and actually realizing that they don't entirely agree with the people that are supposedly on their side, and might even occasionally agree with people who are on the other side in some cases. But I feel like dialogue is just suffering kind of across the board in general at the moment. And I hope for the universities to be a place that actually can help stem that trend. Sir.
I've been curious about the laws in Germany and Austria where if you're a Holocaust denier, you can end up in jail like that Gred Lukianoff out the plane to jail. Do you think our culture could lead us to laws that extreme, politicized?
I think that my dad actually, he's Russian but grew up in Yugoslavia. My mom is ethnically Irish but grew up in Britain. So I spent a lot of time in Europe. I think that one of the things that Europe is actually running into is that it's not actually dealing with something that America has kind of been all along. Is because even though multiculturalism is a relatively new term, we've at least always been a country that understood that the different states don't necessarily like each other and that rights as citizens actually protect you from people you don't necessarily agree with in the society. There wasn't at least much of an idea that basically like America could have an opinion, a single opinion. Whereas kind of countries that think of themselves as nation states, like Germany or England, can have an idea that there's a British opinion and there's a German opinion. And when you have that idea, it's easier to for you at least to get in your head that, okay, I'm just policing opinions that are wrong. I think what Europe is currently running into is that they actually are genuinely becoming more multicultural, and they're trying to deal with it by shutting everybody up as opposed to letting more people speak. I think it's one of these things that's funny because people actually will argue with me about hate speech laws and Holocaust denying laws in Europe and how we have to catch up to Europe. And I think that's just completely backwards. We've been doing a pluralistic society kind of longer than everybody else. And if one thing that we've learned is that if you actually want to have people who don't even necessarily like each other living in the same society, you sure as hell better give them the same right to freedom of speech. So I don't think that things like Holocaust denial laws are a real threat in the U.S. because, and this is actually funny because I used to live in San Francisco, and San Francisco can be really frustrating sometimes because, I have a lot of friends who are like artists and performers and this kind of stuff, and when I talk about First Amendment law, they get sort of indignant because they think of the First Amendment as the thing that prevents hate speech laws. And I'm like, okay, you performance artists benefit from the First Amendment probably 1,000 times every day. And the one time that it actually does something you don't like, you're suddenly against it. That's just so incredibly short-sighted. Meanwhile, I live in Brooklyn. And if there's a place that gets that people, and forgive the expression, but that you have the right to call someone an asshole, and they have the right to call you the same thing, Brooklynites get that. Yes, sir.
I have a clarification and then a question.
Sure.
Earlier, when you were saying,
Well, so people in back can hear you.
What?
It's so people in back can hear you.
Okay. Earlier, when you were saying something about what the legal situation is, you said the First Amendment says that Congress can't pass laws.
Right.
And then you also said, now, is this a legal condition that it doesn't allow mobs to silence opinions?
It's only slightly attenuated in that it doesn't allow the government to permit mobs to silence opinions.
Okay.
And also, if I want to be really technical, the First Amendment actually only technically binds the federal government. It's actually through the 14th Amendment that it actually binds state actors too.
This goes back to several panels ago.
Okay, several panels ago, okay.
We had a little debate about whether...
Could you put the mic a little closer, because I don't think... Yeah.
We had a little debate about whether a newspaper, if it prints a letter, what is their legal responsibility as far as, like, say, libel, or if there's inaccuracies in that letter?
To my knowledge, and this is, I used to really love libel law, and I actually wrote the section in the guide for libel law, but it's been a little while. Is that that a student newspaper or a newspaper in general can be held liable for libel in letters or opinion pieces they publish. But here's an important distinction: libel has to be an assertion of fact. That if you're so that means that basically if you're saying that the best example being Professor Hohenstein is a pedophile. That's classic. You got to verify that if you don't want it to be libelous. But if you say, in my opinion, Barack Obama is a terrible president, or in my opinion, he's a great president, that's something that you can't really make the libel argument about, because it's a pure assertion of opinion. But if you're actually making factual statements that could potentially be defamatory, then yeah, the university, the paper could potentially be on the hook for damages.
Okay, so there's nothing about intent to say if somebody makes an honest mistake and believes that the person is a pedophile, they put a letter in the newspaper. And it was an honest mistake?
Well, that actually gets you into the unfortunately named actual malice standard that we actually were talking about today when it comes to libel. That if the question would be, if the person writes in and says, Professor whomever is a pedophile, and the paper checks it out and it looks very much like he is, if they take reasonable precautions, they can actually use that as a defense later on, because basically it actually gets fairly complicated whether it's an issue of private concern or public concern. If it's a public official, it's actually a pretty complicated analysis. And actually I had some really disturbing discussion today about private speeches. But the intent in that case would be, the issue would be whether or not the paper would be held liable. And if it's a public official and they published it with disregard for the truth or recklessly, then they potentially could be held liable. Okay. And there's a question.
So it does require actual malice.
No, this is going to really sort of deteriorate into a very long lecture on libel, which I'm geek enough that I'm actually up for it. But I don't want to subject you guys to that. All right. Oh, sorry. I thought I was wrapping it up for a second there. Mm-hmm. Can you put it closer to your mouth? I'm actually having a little bit. Yeah.
UNC just enacted a new gender inclusive language policy.
Yep.
I can't find the exact name online, but if I remember correctly, it's basically just the university saying that they want to use words like first year instead of freshman, or chair instead of chairman. And I was wondering
what's wrong with freshmen? Oh, okay, got it.
I was wondering what your opinion on something like that are. It's not that we're punishing the public.
Right. It really depends, and I mean it's one of those things that FIRE is very clear about the difference between aspirational statements and statements that actually come with punishment attached. If they tried to have a policy that said nobody on this campus is allowed to use freshmen, that would be laughably unconstitutional. If they're trying to say, we'd really prefer people to say first year instead of freshman, they absolutely can do that. Then it becomes a statement of opinion. If they're saying that university employees, when they're writing officially things for the university as stated by the university, then they actually have a lot of power over those administrators to the extent to which that they are administrators. However, if they're telling faculty members that they have to use gender inclusive language, then you get into the fact that professors are generally not considered to be speaking state actors when they talk. They're not considered to be speaking for the government, and indeed it would be impossible for them to be speaking for the university, as any two university professors can potentially disagree. It would basically mean that university is making all arguments all the time. So it is one of those answers where it depends. Now, can someone pick on the policy even if it's aspirational? Absolutely, within their rights, they can do that too. So I think I covered most of the different scenarios in which that could be used. But good question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.